most on kids.
Absolutely. The ban on the advertising is a small step in the right direction. You can't get away from the general obesogenic environment that we're living in, but this will help. Yes, the visual effect is a major thing, and also the way that foods advertising for children works by using kind of fun images, offering toys, all those extra things. They all are part of why certain foods become appealing to children. The more they're appealing, the more they ask their parents for them, and we do know that the number of requests by a child to a parent for a certain food will increase the number of times the child will actually be given that food.
Let me finish where we started, as it were, and I don't want to fall out for 1 minute with Tracy Chatterley or indeed any other mum or dad, but is the real burden upon them to overpower the potency of the advertising message?
Well, I'm a parent myself, so I understand your question fully. Yes, there's a certain amount of responsibility here from parents, from schools, and generally the community that we're in. It's going to help by taking away advertising, but it's not going to be the be-all and end-all. The causes of obesity are multifaceted, and this is just one of those streams that we can try and look at to tackling, but ultimately we are responsible for what we're feeding our children.
Fascinating. Dr. Gemma Whitcomb from Loughborough University, thank you so much for joining us. Now, hundreds of police officers have been accused of abusing their power to sexually exploit vulnerable victims of crime. An inspection of officers in England and Wales found that there were more than 400 claims made over a 2-year period. The Home Secretary called the findings shocking. Nick Wallace has more.
It's the worst kind of corruption. Hundreds of police officers across the country stand accused of abusing their authority for sexual gain. Many target vulnerable women, victims of domestic abuse.
It is the ultimate violation of trust where the guardian becomes the abuser. And we are saying in our report that more needs to be done to prevent that from happening. And we will only prevent it from happening if victims come forward and report it, and if the police service is more vigilant about preventing it happening.
436 allegations of abuse were made over a 2-year period involving 306 police officers. 5 forces, Dyfed Powys, Cleveland, Gloucestershire, North Wales and South Yorkshire have been criticised for not doing more.
We do know from scandal after scandal after scandal that this happens. There should be no, I was shocked, but we shouldn't be shocked. Actually, we know this happens and we've got to do something to prevent it in the first place.
The crimes committed by some police officers are horrendous. PC Darren Heath was jailed for nearly 4 years for multiple offences in Gloucestershire, including getting a vulnerable woman pregnant and forcing her to have an abortion. PC Stephen Walters from West Midlands Police was jailed for 4 years for sexually assaulting a woman in his patrol car. PC Stephen Mitchell from the Northumbrian Force was jailed for life for raping and assaulting women he met on duty, and serial rapist PC Wayne Scott from Cleveland Police was able to commit sex offences over a 10-year period without being effectively challenged about his behaviour. According to the Inspectorate's figures, in a 1-year period, 67 officers were dismissed from the force or resigned after having had a relationship with a vulnerable person. But it's not known how many were subsequently charged with criminal offences. One former police officer says, we need to keep things in perspective.
This is a very small minority in comparison to the 125,000 cops out there who do a fantastic job day in and day out. There's enough knocking of the police right now, and I'd just like to impress upon the public that actually police officers don't want to work with people who are abusing their authority, particularly for sexual favours, and they will do something about that.
The report recommends an urgent review of the way all police forces in England and Wales handle allegations made against their officers. Nick Wallace, ITV News.
The Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson has risked causing a diplomatic row by criticising one of Britain's key allies in the Middle East. He accused Saudi Arabia of puppeteering and engaging in proxy wars in other countries for its own benefit. Downing Street, in effect, put Mr Johnson in his place, saying these were the Foreign Secretary's personal views. Well, our Deputy Political Editor, Chris Shipp, joins me live now from outside the Foreign Office. Chris, a diplomatic gaffe or an inconvenient truth about the political situation in the region?
Well, Alistair, there were, as you will know, many people who wondered when Boris Johnson was made Foreign Secretary here in the summer, wondered whether he would end up putting his feet in holes that diplomats would normally walk around. And so it would appear to be the case here, because he's criticised Saudi Arabia for being a force of instability in the Gulf region. And yet Saudi Arabia is a UK ally. The government's position is that we support the things that Saudi Arabia is doing, particularly in the Yemen, where the Saudi-led coalition is supporting the legitimate government there. Now, Boris Johnson made these comments last week. It was at a conference in Italy. Let's just have a listen to what it was he said.
You've got the Saudis, the Iran, everybody moving in and puppeteering and playing proxy wars. And it's a tragedy to watch it. We need to have some way of encouraging visionary leadership in that area.
Downing Street doesn't disagree with what he said about Iran, but they do disagree with what he said about Saudi Arabia. And you know, just yesterday, Alistair, I was sat in a room with Theresa May and the King of Saudi Arabia as she was on that trip to Bahrain, and she was saying some very nice things about Saudi Arabia because she needs the countries in that region to do trade deals for when we leave the European Union. Downing Street says that Theresa May disagrees with him on Saudi Arabia, but does agree with him on Iran.
Chris, thank you very much. And apologies for just a little bit of interference there towards the end of that live link to the Foreign Office. Now, it was one of the defining reasons that many people voted for Brexit back in June, and now MPs say they need to know more about what the public thinks about immigration. They announced a tour of the country today to ask people directly how the changing nature of Britain's population has affected their lives. It's being led by the Labour MP Yvette Cooper, who wants people's views to shape policy decisions during the Brexit negotiations.
We know that immigration will be a central issue in the Brexit negotiations, but there is no consensus at the moment about what Britain wants out of the deal. We know that immigration and the desire to have more control over immigration was an important reason for many people voting to leave, but there hasn't been a discussion about what kind of control that should mean.
Now, the head of MI6 says that Britain can never be safe from Syrian terror threats until the civil war in that country is brought to an end. Alex Younger says what he called the murderously efficient Islamic State is currently plotting violent attacks against the UK, despite being under military pressure in Syria. And he called the scale of the terror threat unprecedented. Well, our security editor, Rohit Katru, is with me. You were there. It is an unusual event, but how significant was the content?
Well, it was certainly a rare speech from the man who's known as C. We were invited into MI6 this morning. He spoke for 20 minutes, and this was largely a PR exercise. The real aim for him, I suspect, is the fact that they need to get new recruits. They are one of those few public organisations that are actually expanding at the moment. But in outlining the threats from national to national and international security, he made an unusually sharp attack on the Russians. He was referring to the air actions in Aleppo and elsewhere in Syria, and this is what he had to say.
In defining as a terrorist anyone who opposes a brutal regime, they alienate precisely that group that has to be on side if the extremists are to be defeated. Meanwhile, in Aleppo, Russia and the Syria regime seek to make a desert and call it peace. The human tragedy is heartbreaking.
And he said that the impact of that desert that they're calling peace will be on our own national security in the UK. He says that desert creates an environment in which people are even more likely to be radicalised.
Fascinating. Rohit, thank you. Still to come, why the future of the giraffe is under threat and the reasons behind a huge drop in numbers. And the inspirational first steps of the Brazilian footballer who survived his team's plane crash. But first, more tensions over the troubled retailer Sports Direct. Despite a huge fall in profits, bosses have ordered an executive jet. Profits plummeted by more than a third in the first half of the year. Its chairman blamed what he said was extreme coverage by politicians and the media. Well, figures from the company show a drop of 57% in profits, down to £71.6 million. And our business editor, Joel Hills, joined me live in the studio. We have talked of this before. What are the continuing problems?
Well, there are some obvious ones. I mean, we know that Sports Direct has spent much of the last year. Mike Ashley, its chief executive, who mostly owned the company, has been fighting off all these suggestions that the company effectively mistreats its staff. Sports Direct's handed out pay rises. That will have dented profits. It's also been hit, Alistair, by the fall in the value of the pound since the referendum, something that Sports Direct doesn't seem to have prepared for. But the chairman of the company, Keith Hallowell, has a rather interesting take on events. He said this morning, "I have no doubt that the extreme political, union and media campaign waged against this company has not only damaged its reputation and influenced our customers, it has impacted negatively on the morale of our people. I begin to question whether this intense scrutiny is all ethically motivated."
Ouch.
Ouch.
Does buying a £50 million private jet help that media campaign?
40 million, Alistair. It's a sign of restraint.
$50 million, £40 million.
Well, and Sports Direct already has a helicopter, let's remember. No, what it's saying is that it needs its directors to have an aeroplane too, so that, in its words, it can operate efficiently across its global footprint. It is also, however, making guarantees to 3,000 staff in line for a bonus next year that it will underpin and guarantee it. Those bonuses are in shares and the share price hasn't looked too good just recently. Mike Ashley owns 56% of the company. Shareholders own the rest, and they will be very disappointed today to see what's happened to the share price, down 7% so far.
Joel, as always, thank you. Now, with both sides claiming victory in Parliament last night over the terms and timing of Britain's departure from the European Union, the top-level legal battle draws to a close later today. Final arguments and possible rebuttals are being heard at the Supreme Court about how and by whom the exit mechanism of Article 50 is to be triggered. The judgment is expected in January. Local authorities in England spend close to nothing on mental health, according to the charity Mind. Figures show each local authority spending less than 1% of its health budget on mental health, on average. Charity also found money spent in this area has fallen year on year for the last 3 years. And a century on his Test debut for the batsman Keaton Jennings put England in a strong position after day one of the third Test against India. He was eventually out for 112, and England closed on 288 for 5. Now, to the list of endangered species today was added the giraffe. Conservation had sworn that we are heading toward a silent extinction, with numbers plunging 40% over the last 3 decades. 30 years ago, there were more than 160,000 giraffe in existence. In 2015, that number had dropped to less than 100,000. Helena Carter explains how hunger, more than anything, has led to the slow demise of one of nature's most extraordinary creatures.
Getting so close to such a magnificent animal is a privilege, but it seems like this that we're at risk of losing. Scientists have put giraffes on the official watch list of threatened and endangered species worldwide. Kenya's Giraffe Centre in Nairobi is home to a family of adopted Rothschild's giraffes, the most endangered type. Farming, illegal hunting and civil unrest in many parts of Africa driving the decline.
People started clearing down vegetation to create room for agriculture. So in the process, the giraffes started dying due to lack of food. And also human beings used to kill them in case they invaded in the crop field.
Their decline is being described by conservationists as a silent extinction. The giraffe population shrinking by 40% in just 30 years.
I think for the world, the conservation community, the public, governments to realise that an animal that we perhaps thought wasn't threatened at all is under these increasing pressures, and it really draws attention of all of us to this species and can make sure we put more conservation effort into conserving them.
Researchers say there is hope for the world's giraffe population if the right conservation efforts are put in place. That hope and positivity seen here today with the brand new arrival of this baby giraffe, joining other youngsters doing their own bit to boost the numbers of this most beautiful of creatures. Helena Carter, ITV News.
And finally, one of the Brazilian football players pulled from the wreckage of a plane crash that killed 19 of his teammates has taken his first steps since the disaster. Alan Rochelle was rescued from the crash site in Colombia after suffering multiple fractures. But now he's on the road to recovery, as Sangeeta Kandola reports.
A thumbs up from his hospital room and supported by his doctor. Alan Rochelle, one of 6 survivors of Colombia's tragic plane crash, had a message for the world. He thanked everyone for their strength through prayers, warmth and kindness that he had received whilst recovering. Miraculously, Alan Rochelle was pulled from the wreckage of the plane that went down in a mountainous area of Colombia last week. More than 70 people were killed, including 19 of his Chapecoense football teammates. It is a tragedy that has been felt across Brazil and indeed the world, with an outpouring of tributes for all those lives cut so devastatingly short. The 27-year-old defender was the first survivor to be rescued. Doctors say the footballer suffered multiple fractures in the crash. A week ago, his family say he could only gesture. Now, out of intensive care, he is walking and talking. He says he's doing well and he hopes to be back in Brazil soon to continue his recovery. Sangeeta Kandola, ITV News.
And that is it this lunchtime. I'll be back later with Mary Nightingale for the ITV Evening News. The news where you are follows the national weather, but for now, from all of us, bye-bye and have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.